Hey guys, hope you're doing good. For this week's compilation, I'm compiling all the rarest Pokemon top 10s from various games on the Nintendo Switch. Like always, if there's a specific video you want, it'll be in the description below with a timestamp. I will also be back with new content again the weekend after New Year's. Enjoy, guys!
Now that Sword and Shield has been out for nearly a month, I'm sure most of you have finished the game by now. And once the story is over, one of the biggest tasks to complete after is 100%ing the Pokedex. Catching some Pokemon will be pretty easy, as you'll encounter a ton of Magikarp and Rookidee throughout the game. But what about those rare Pokemon that make completing your dex a huge pain in the butt? Well, after a bit of research, I think I found the 10 rarest Pokemon in Sword and Shield. One thing that I wanted to mention is that this won't be done in any particular order like a regular top 10. Between these 10 different entries, there are just so many factors to take into consideration that it would be extremely difficult to determine exactly which is one of the rarest of the group. So I feel it's easier in all of us doing it this way. At the end of the day, all these are pretty difficult to get in a normal playthrough, and that's what counts on a list like this. One last thing to mention is that quite a few of these will be based on weather. We're going by the regular random chance everyone will have in a normal playthrough. So with all that out of the way, let's just hop right into it. The first Pokemon we're going to talk about is Togepi. You all might remember having to snag yourself a Togepi for the best team for Pokemon Sword that went live last week. Yes, this adorable little egg is decently hard to find. Togepi can be found in Bridgefield in the wild area under 3 different weather conditions, being normal, overcast, and fog. Fog will give you the highest chance of finding Togepi at 5%, but if you find yourself under normal or overcast conditions, you're only going to have a 2% chance of finding this baby Pokemon. At the very least though, you have multiple opportunities to snag one. It's just not going to be that easy. Coming up next, we have a tie between version exclusives being Jangmo-o and Larvitar. Now these two Pokemon can be found in the same exact location under the same conditions as the same level of rarity. The only difference is what version you're going to find them in, which is why we have them sharing the same spot. Both of these pseudo-legendaries in the making have a 5% chance to be found, which on the surface doesn't seem to be too bad. When you consider that they can only be found in the Lake of Outrage, it means it won't be until very late game that you even have the opportunity to find either one of them. And even once you get the bike upgrade, you'll only be able to find them under the weather conditions of overcast or intense sun. And even with all those conditions met, if any of them are over level 50, you'll have to wait until after you beat the 7th gym to actually catch them, making it just that much more annoying to get. So while these two might be easy to get for purchasers of the double pack, you can see that's not much the case with finding them normally in game. Following those two, we have another set of Pokemon that I've been putting on a few lists recently, and those are Dracozolt and Arctovish. In general, it's not really that hard to get Arctozolt and Dracofish, as you can obtain these fossils in Route 6 and in the Pokemon Center in Stoneside. The Dino and Bird fossils are the common fossils to obtain in Sword, whereas the Dragon and Fish fossils are easier to obtain in Shield. But if you want to get the other two in either versions, you're going to have to trade them over as a held item on Pokemon, or get extremely lucky with the Left Digging Brother, which is going to require a lot of watts and patience. I'm not exactly sure how rare it is to obtain these fossils, but I will say you'll be getting a lot more rare bones and comet shards than you will with the more rare fossils. And if you're a competitive player, you'll definitely want to get your hands on Dracozolt, as it's pretty solid. In the next spot on the list, we have 2 more hard to find version exclusives in Stonjourner and Ice-Q. Now while these two counterparts are tough to find on Route 10, having only a 2% chance to find each of them, they at least have the benefit of being found in all weather conditions there. Like many other low encounter rate Pokemon on this list, they can also be found at the Lake of Outrage under certain weather conditions, being intense sun and sandstorm for Stonjourner at 2% and 5% respectively, and then snowing and snowstorm at 2% and 5% respectively for Ice-Q. When it comes to finding them on Route 10, they're definitely not the most difficult to find compared to quite a few others in this list, but don't think you're going to find them too quickly either. There's a good chance you'll be searching for quite a few minutes. At the halfway mark, we have a Shield exclusive Glorian form in Corsola. Interestingly enough, Corsola doesn't quite line up in terms of location or chance to find it compared to any of its Sword counterparts. All the other version exclusives are much easier to find, with all of them being able to be found in all weather conditions, whereas Corsola can only be found at a 5% chance in the Giant's Mirror section of the wild area when the weather is overcast. The same actually does apply to Glory and Farfetch'd, but the main difference is that Farfetch'd can be found on Route 5 in all weather conditions, making it objectively easier to find and catch when compared to its shield counterpart. It actually took me quite a while to find a Glory and Corsola, and if you would have told me it was a sword exclusive before I found it in my shield copy, I probably would have believed you because I couldn't find it for the life of me. I talked about how much I love Glory and Corsola in a couple of my latest videos. I loved regular Corsola for so long, but the concept and design for its Galarian form is just amazing, and having the great evolution in Corsola makes this a top tier line of Pokemon. With that being said, finding it wasn't an enjoyable experience and made my life super difficult. Getting into the second half of the list, I have two Pokemon you all were probably expecting, and that is both Dreepy and Dracloak. These two Pokemon in the Galar Pseudo-Legendary line are unbelievably difficult to find. Now, of course, this is a reoccurring theme on this list for sure, as the pseudo-legendary Pokemon are incredibly difficult to find in these games, usually being at a 5% chance under certain conditions. Usually that's not so bad, but with Dreepy and Dracloak it is. But both of them can be found yet again at our favorite location, the Lake of Outrage. And hey, you guessed it, there are certain weather conditions that need to be met in order to make either of them appear. For Dreepy specifically, you have a 1% chance to find it in the grass when the weather is overcast. This gets bumped up to a gigantic 2% when the weather is either fog or thunderstorm. Yeah, because that's really helpful. Now Dracloak is made a little bit easier to find as it gives you one extra weather condition to find it under, being rain. Problem with that is that it's at a 1% alongside overcast. At the very least, Game Freak made it an overworld encounter so you can at least see the dang thing. But what does that matter when you have such low chances of finding one under such tough weather conditions? Honestly, the Droopy line is one of, if not my favorite pseudo-legendary lines in the entire series. They've got great designs, a cool typing, and most importantly, it's super strong. I would have absolutely loved to put the Droopy line on the best team because it's certainly one of the strongest Pokemon in the games. But unfortunately, it's just too hard to find, so we only got to admire it from afar. Maybe in some other region, this line will be a little bit easier to find. A guy can only hope. Okay, this is my last shared slot, I promise. For this entry, we have the last set of version-exclusive pseudo-legendaries in Gumi and Dano. I'll give you all a chance to guess where in Galar these two Pokemon can possibly be found. I bet you'll never be able to figure it out. Yeah, these two Pokemon reside in none other than the Lake of Outrage. I can see why they call it that. And there's a certain Pokemon that you want, the Lake of Outrage will more than likely have it. But you're going to have to wait a long time and work your butt off to get them. And that's bound to cause a little bit of outrage. So what are the conditions for getting these two Pokemon, you might ask? Well, they both can only be found when it's raining at a 2% chance of actually finding it. Yeah, that's absolutely ridiculous. I feel especially bad for the people that really want a Hydreigon on their team. It was already bad enough that you already have to wait until level 64 to evolve one, which in this region means you'll be borderline overleveling once you get to the championship match. But you have to wait until late game to even attempt to get one. If it's not raining in the Lake of Outrage, well, you're out of luck. And if it is raining, well, get comfy while you're there because you're not leaving anytime soon. The Goodra fans have it a little bit easier because you only need to be level 50 in the rain. So if you find Gumi, you're already set. But either way, it's going to be a pain to obtain. And I don't envy the people that have their hearts set out on looking for them. Next up, we have the adorable Pikachu wannabe, Mimikyu. I was very pleased to see that Mimikyu made it through the National Dex cut, as it's such a solid Pokemon, and it's just plain awesome concept-wise. But when it came to actually finding it, I wondered if I just imagined it being present in the trailers, because I couldn't find it anywhere. Well, the reason for that is because it only has a 3% chance of being found in the Giant's Mirror while there's fog. Now, you can also encounter it at Bridgefield as a strong encounter in the fog as well, but there's only like an 11% chance of getting that weather, and even then, it'll be level 50, so you won't be able to catch it until after you get the 6th badge. Now I will say that I do like the fact they can only be found in the fog, as that kind of weather is very fitting for an ominous Pokemon like Mimikyu, but only having those two locations and it's such a low percentage is actually a pain. It really makes it feel like this Pokemon isn't even in the games at all. The list will be wrapping up soon, and I couldn't think of a better Pokemon to talk about other than Duraludon. We were shown Duraludon very early on in the Sword and Shield news cycle, and I think a lot of people were hyped for it, being that it was touted as being really strong, going toe-to-toe with Tyranitar, and it's part Dragon type. I think a lot of people thought this was going to be our pseudo-legendary Pokemon, meaning we probably wouldn't see it until late game. Now we obviously know that's not the case, but it still was a late game encounter and a hard one to find at that. Now it can be found under all weather conditions in the Giant Sea as a strong encounter, but it will be at level 65, meaning you can't catch it it until you beat every gym, and even then, it won't be too easy to catch. So if you want to get yourself one any sooner, you're going to need to head to the Lake of Outrage yet again. And this time it's during a snowstorm to have yourself a solid 2% chance to catch it. Or you can take your chances on a Route 10, but you'll have an even tougher time at just a 1% chance to find it in the overworld. Duraludon might not be the pseudo-legendary of this region, but when it comes to finding it, it's certainly treated like it is. Now, before we go over our last rare Pokemon, I just wanted to list off a few honorable mentions. First off, we have one of the best team members being Riolu, which can be found during a snowstorm at a 5% rate in every part of the Giant's Cap in the wild area. Don't get me wrong, that's a little difficult, but it really isn't the hardest by a long shot. Next, we have Trapinch, which is a little difficult to find in Shield, having a 5% chance in all weather conditions on Route 6, and a 2% chance during a sandstorm in Hammerlock Hills. A little difficult, but not the worst in the world. However, if you're a sword player, you can only get it on Route 6, and that rate drops from a 5% chance all the way to a 1%. I'm not sure why they decided to make it tougher for sword players, but that's just a reality you're all going to have to deal with. And finally, the last honorable mention will be the Charmander line. Now you could say it's pretty easy as you get Charmander as a gift from Leon, so you're guaranteed to get one. But that's not until post-game. If you want to get one before then you're going to need to get yourself one in a max raid battle. And those have so many Pokemon to draw from. You can find them as a rare encounter in dens 53 and 77. So if you want to get one during your in-game playthrough, well, I wish you luck. And finally, the last Pokemon we're going to talk about today is the Sea Creeper Pokemon, Dhelmise. Now, Dhelmise was such a hard Pokemon to get when Sun and Moon first came out, only having a 1% chance of being fished up while in the Seafolk Village, or a 10% while this spot was bubbling. Game Freak made that a little easier in the Ultra games, giving it a 5% and a 35% chance of being fished up. But it seems they wanted to go back on that and make it hard on us again. No matter what, Dhelmise is always going to be a 1% chance to encounter. Now, sure, there are two different areas in Route 9 that you can encounter Dhelmise, and it can be done in any weather condition, but you'll never get an easier chance of catching one. Now, I didn't have the time or patience to figure out the exact math for all these Pokemon to determine which was actually the hardest, but just from experience and taking a wild guess, I think it's safe to say Dhelmise is one, if not the rarest Pokemon to find in Pokemon Sword and Shield.
Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl have been out for a couple weeks now, and they are filled with so many difficult Pokemon to encounter. So today, I wanted to break down the top 10 rarest and hardest Pokemon to get in Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. In this video, I'll be discussing Pokemon that are hard to obtain for a variety of reasons, such as their encounter rates, how hard they are to catch, or even the prerequisites in order to find these obscure Pokemon. If you enjoy, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more videos like this. Also be sure to let me know what Pokemon you found to be really rare or just plain hard to get. With that said, let's get started. At number 10, we have a Pokemon I'm sure a lot of people thought would rank higher on today's list. But because of how hard some of these mons are to find, number 10 is Rotom. Rotom is actually not very difficult to encounter in comparison to this list, because it's a static Pokemon. However, there are a couple of things you need to do first. One of the first things you need to do would be making sure you have the National Pokedex, which means you need to see the first 150 Pokemon in Sinnoh's Regional Pokedex. First things first, this number doesn't include Manaphy, which means you can actually do what's necessary through local play alone. Not only that, but these games make it possible to do this as soon as you've played through the Elite Four successfully. Even Dialga and Palkia can be found in the opposite version game thanks to a photo you'd find in Celestic Town, making this a very realistic encounter compared to others on today's list. Despite the regional Pokedex being easy enough to complete in Sinnoh, it's still definitely going to take a bit of work. If that wasn't enough, however, you also need to make sure that you're encountering it at night. This means you need to make sure your console is set between 8 PM to 3:59 AM at the time of your encounter, or you will be out of luck. Changing your console's time can technically work for this. However, it will mess up all your other day and night events for a couple of days, so I wouldn't really endorse doing this. Rotom overall is just a rather tedious Pokemon to go about getting, making it number 10 on today's list. So up next on our list is going to be none other than the infamous Drifloon.
Drifloon, I'm sure, is a Pokemon that has ruined a few of your guys' national Pokedex runs over the first week for launch. Seeing as I'm sure plenty of trainers had to deal with the annoying encounter restrictions for this Pokemon. Drifloon is a Pokemon that you can only find on Fridays, which by itself really isn't too big of a deal. There are countless other Pokemon in this series, such as Lapras and Heart Gold and Soul Silver, that are restricted to one day of the week. But what makes Drifloon special is what else you need to do in order to unlock it. See, the worst part about Drifloon's encounter is that while you're locked to Friday of all days while making this encounter take place at Valley Windworks, due to Drifloon's encounter restriction, you actually need to wait until the following Friday after beating Mars in order to find it at Valley Windworks. Because Valley Windworks is so early in your adventure, even finding this Pokemon at all becomes infinitely more difficult, causing a ton of trainers to have to scramble at the last second to find someone with the Drifloon to fill their Pokedex space. I think Rotom's regular requirement is a bit harder, but the fact that most trainers probably didn't have to wait a full week again just to find Rotom makes me personally rate Drifloon right above Rotom at our number 9 slot. Our next entry is a Pokemon I'm sure several other players here have had the displeasure of trying to encounter, being Combee. Combee is a Pokemon that is absolutely useless about 88% of the time. It's so bad that you could probably find a male Combee solo run in any game it's in with ease. It's just such a meme-worthy Pokemon at this point. So, female Combee, they have a very difficult 12.5% encounter rate, and are the only Combee that will actually evolve into Vespiquen. This means if your Combee is male, you're either saving it for some sort of challenge run, or you're putting it in a box never to be used again. If this wasn't hard enough, it's actually extremely tiresome to find Combee. You need to slather honey on one of the 21 honey trees in Sinnoh, and it's also an uncommon Pokemon among these trees. Sitting at a 20% encounter rate, your combined odds of finding a female Combee at these honey trees is around 2.5%. You also have to wait 6 hours before you can even see if the honey tree was successful at finding a Combee, which adds in a very difficult time requirement. And even with the better chance of finding it in Sinnoh's Grand Underground, it's still going to be a very annoying Pokemon to try and get your hands on. My advice for this would honestly just be finding someone who can breed you a female Combee, because you're wasting your time finding this Pokemon, which is why Combee sits at number 8. Lucky number 7 today is our first group entry, but the reason for it is because their encounter is the exact same. We have at number 7 the Pokemon exclusive to Trophy Garden. If you didn't know, Trophy Garden has a few Pokemon such as Porygon, Eevee, Plusle, and Minun, and many others that you can only actually find in the post-game at Trophy Garden. These actually have a 5% encounter rate, and they just require you having the national dex. As we mentioned before, in comparison to other Pokemon games, this is actually a fairly reasonable regional dex to complete. So, if these are all 5% to find, why do they rank so high on the list? The big problem with the Trophy Garden Pokemon comes from how every single day you're only able to encounter 2 Pokemon. You'll always find one specific Pokemon that Mr. Backlock mentions, as well as the one he mentioned the previous day, at any given time for 5% each. The issue, though, is that every day, these will change in order of their national Pokedex number. So if you wait 2 days too long, you're going to have to wait just over 2 weeks in order to find Porygon again if that was the Pokemon you were looking for. This makes the Trophy Garden encounters responsible for some of the longest wait times of any Pokemon in these games, landing them at number 7 on today's list. Wrapping up our first half of the list is a Pokemon that is extremely well known for being difficult to get. In BDSP, this Pokemon is very difficult not only to catch, but also to even find in the first place, being Beldum. Beldum is one of our Swarm Pokemon, which basically function as higher encounter variants of our Trophy Garden Pokemon. These Pokemon are on random routes with a 40% encounter rate 24 hours. The issue being, however, unlike the Trophy Garden, these seem to actually be completely random in terms of what Pokemon you'll find on any given day. This means finding Beldum among the list of 28 Pokemon is pretty tedious already. If they didn't make it hard enough, let's not even get into how difficult Beldum would be to actually obtain. Going for Beldum means you need to obtain your national dex, as well as complete the first 7 wins at the Battle Tower. While this isn't hard in itself, it's more so just adding on to how complicated this Pokemon is to even find. After this, you can make your way to the resort area, and onwards to Route 228, where you'll actually have access to the route Beldum is located on. Beldum also has a pretty low catch rate of 3. This puts Beldum above even Dialga and Palkia in terms of catching difficulty. However, at least they finally stopped it from damaging itself with Takedown this gen. Sadly though, Beldum will be a Pokemon you'll have to put in a lot of effort to even find in the first place. But it's a very rewarding Pokemon to obtain, to say the least. All these factors land Beldum at number 6 on today's list. Opening up the top 5 is our next joint entry on today's list, coming from Sinnoh's 2 infamous roaming legendaries, Mesprit and Cresselia. Both of these Pokemon are very difficult to even make appear at your location, as the area you'll find them changes every time you change locations on your map. You can, however, actually manipulate this by going back and forth between a route and town until you find its location on your map. You only have 1 turn to catch these Pokemon, however, or they will flee and you'll have to encounter them again. These Pokemon at first sound like they should be at the top of our list. However, unlike higher options, there are strategies you can use to alleviate this. For example, if you bring a mean look Pokemon faster than these, you can actually use it in order to trap them while you throw Pokeballs at them. The best choice here would probably be a Murkrow in my opinion, due to the fact you'll have access to mean look, Roost, and the Dark typing, meaning you'll have the best chances of trapping these 2 Psychic types for as long as possible. You can even teach it Thunder Wave for a status option in order to make catching both easier. So this, in my opinion, is the most ideal mean look user you could utilize for this encounter. I still think, despite the mean look or Shadow Tag route, that these Pokemon are obnoxious to even locate in the first place, which would be why I have them at number 5 on today's list. Next up on today's list is the Sinnoh Regi, being Regigigas. Regigigas actually has a rather mundane catch method in comparison to others on this list. You just need to catch all the Regis and bring them to the temple in Snowpoint City. The only problem with this is that the only way to do this currently is by catching the 3 Titan Pokemon first. Legendaries already are more difficult Pokemon to obtain, so having to catch 3 just to encounter Regigigas is pretty difficult. To make matters worse, to get the Regis, you need access to Ramanas Park. I'll get into Ramanas Park later into the video a bit more, but you need 9 mysterious shards, which you can find in the underground, in order to buy the 3 slates that you need to encounter Regirock, Registeel, and Regice. These shards are very rare items to find, but at least that's arguably the hardest part about this. It's mostly just an additive encounter to everything before this, because like Pokemon such as Rotom or Beldum, you'll need the National Dex to access Ramanas Park. So this isn't even anything new for you if you made it this far in the video. Their catch rates are actually rather tame compared to Pokemon such as Beldum, but I still think that all the prerequisites to even unlock your Regigigas encounter keep it at our 4th place on today's list. Our 3rd place on today's list is probably one of the most infamously difficult encounters from the original Sinnoh games, being Spiritomb. Spiritomb is a Pokemon that requires you to utilize the Grand Underground function, which seems to be common among a few of our top contenders on today's list. You'll need to place your odd keystone at the Crumbled Tower on the route right before Solaceon Town, and then talk to 32 unique NPCs in the underground. The issue is how difficult these NPCs are to actually locate. Because of the fact you can't actually talk to real trainers, this means you'll need to find where all these NPCs are located. The problem is, the location of each trainer is randomized to a few locations. There is a specific place you can actually drop into though, with the chance of finding every single trainer, being Oreburgh City. If you go to the underground here, the route you spawn on will have a giant square where you can go in and out of the rooms in order to find the unique NPC to your current path. Oreburgh's underground square has a small chance of finding every NPC in the underground, however, whereas most other routes have a chance of about 1 to 5 different NPCs. If you want more info, I recommend checking out Austin John Play's video on this, as he explains it in far greater detail. This process takes several hours of actively playing, but if you put in the time, you can find yourself a spirit tomb. So surely you can see why it deserves to be in the top 3. The penultimate Pokemon, as hinted at earlier in the video, are none other than the Ramanas Park cover legendaries and Mewtwo. These Pokemon are basically just a more difficult version of finding the Regis, because you need to find specific Pokemon prior to each encounter. For example, if I want to find Ho-Oh, I need to encounter Raikou, Entei, Suicune, Latias, Latios, Regirock, Registeel, and Regice before even getting a chance to encounter Ho-Oh. This means I need to find the mysterious shards for all of these slates as well as Ho-Oh's slate. There's not really a lot to discuss for these Pokemon that I haven't already mentioned, but it's basically like a significantly harder version of Regigigas' encounter because you'll need to find more legendaries on top of the Regi trio, with the amount depending on which legendary you're aiming to encounter. With this in mind, we'll place Ramanas Park's legendary encounters at number 2 on today's list. Finally, our number 1 encounter is probably the hardest encounter to even locate in any given Pokemon game, being none other than Milotic. Milotic has a chain of difficult points in this encounter, whether we go over the encounter itself or the evolution method in these games. Starting with how you even find Milotic, you need to go into the surf room of Mount Coronet on the way to Snowpoint City, and fish using a good rod. From here, there is a random collection of 4 tiles that will have any chance at all of finding a Feebas, so you'll have to find these through painstaking effort. There shouldn't be any way to actually locate these other than trial and error. So hopefully you'll get lucky with this part and actually find your Feebas tiles quickly. From here, you'll also have to worry about evolving Feebas into Milotic. Since the Prism scale is no longer a factor, we're back to maxing your beauty stat out. You'll have to bake lots of Poffins in order to do this, which means you should find a massive amount of Oran Berries. Oran Berries should allow you the easiest way to make Poffins that will boost your beauty stat, so just mix Poffins until you do so. Next, you'll need to level up Feebas once in battle, and then you'll finally have a Milotic. Between all these factors, I think that Milotic is arguably the hardest Pokemon to obtain in Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl.
Hey there guys, and welcome to another Legends Arceus video. This time we're going to be going over the top 10 hardest Pokemon to obtain in Legends Arceus. I did something similar for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl and had a good time putting together that list, so I decided to revisit it for this game. There are a lot of new and different ways to capture and in general obtain Pokemon in these games, and some can be pretty darn difficult. You may need to use an item during a certain time of day or get to a seriously high level. I looked at everything, and while there are less difficult Pokemon to get in these games than usual, I still think the 10 lined up for this video will be satisfactory. So let's go ahead and just hop into it. We've got a lot to talk about. So we're going to kick off the video today with an interesting entry, being the OG Psychic Pokemon, Abra.
So the thing about Abra being hard to get your hands on isn't the fact that it's hard to find or that there are special conditions to getting it. No, Abra is literally hard to get your hands on. The thing teleports all over the place. You need to sneak up behind it to actually get it to stay in place. And that can be hard, as the smallest misstep and you're spotted. It's not what is traditionally seen as being difficult to get, but for me, it certainly could be at times. Honestly, it feels a little unfair the way Pokemon notice you creeping about. You know how many alphas I had turn around on me when I had little to no noise when approaching them? Sure, what you could do to get around an issue with Abra is throwing a wing ball from a relatively decent distance away. But even then, it can get annoying with spotting you. It's very reminiscent of a battle you participate in later in the game if you unlock the Darkrai request, where it too will bounce around annoyingly with dark teleportation whenever you throw a ball at it. It's important to get Abra for your Pokedex, but I also recognize that the difficulty in capturing it is not at the same level as the rest of this list, which is what places it firmly in the number 10 spot today. Next up on the list, we've got a whole ton of Pokemon all tied for this spot. The ones that are exclusively available inside of time-space distortions. We're talking Pokemon ranging from original forms of Hisuian forms like Sneasel, to Pokemon that have no reason to exist in the past like Porygon. As you guys are aware at this point, the distortions like to show up at their leisure, with no known way of how to trigger them at the time of this video. There are certain Pokemon that are only available by way of these distortions. Like I said, Porygon is one, but others included are Weavile, Magnemite and Magneton, the Bastiodon line, and the Rampardos line. I kind of hate that this is the only way to get some of these Pokemon due to how rare a distortion can be, and the fact that you're not guaranteed to find any of these Pokemon. But even then, they're only the number 9 spot here. They can be super rare and hard to get in their own right, but still you're usually able to find at least one of these exclusive Pokemon per distortion, whether it's the one you're looking for or not. There are definitely more annoying Pokemon to try and find, as you'll see by the end of the video. We've got another group entry here, as I'm gonna go over all the baby Pokemon here in the games, because I know I've had a bit of a hard time finding them, and their actual rates of appearing aren't high by any means. For instance, Pichu has more than an 8% chance of being found in any possible areas that it can spawn. Elekid, Mime Jr., Magby, Togepi, Cleffa, and Happiny all have these low rates too. So trying to find them out in the wild can get very tedious when you're constantly needing to leave an area and go back just to see if they've bothered to show up. There are so many of them with such low rates, it's honestly miserable trying to hunt them down. And at times, it almost feels more worth it to wait for an outbreak. And the odds of triggering one are awful. At the very least, with dimensional rifts, you're able to go about doing other things in an area while waiting for them to open up. But with the baby Pokemon, you just need to get heading back to Jubilife Village and coming back over and over again. And it's just so annoying to have to do. I honestly think it's worse than the other two, but quite frankly, the rest of the list is genuinely hard to get as opposed to just literally rare Pokemon. This next entry is once again 2 Pokemon, but it makes tons of sense to group them together as they have the same method of being obtained. So there is a request in the game from Professor Laventon, where he asks you to solve the mystery of a Pokemon he saw in the ocean, which he believes is connected to the Sea Legend. Now, if you've played Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, you have an idea of what you have to do to solve this request, as there was a book added into the Canalave library that spoke of this very legend. It was a great bit of connection between Legends Arceus and the 4th gen remakes, but for those that didn't pick them up, this mission may as well be impossible. You have to bring a Buizel, Mantike, and Overquill into the Cobalt Coastlands and swim through that gate-looking thing near the Coastlands camp. Then, you'll unlock a doorway somewhere in the mountains, and inside, you've got a Manaphy and a few Phione waiting for you. That's right, they're the entry here, because they can be very hard to get if you have no damn idea how to complete this request. Also, if that wasn't bad enough, getting Overquill is an absolute chore as well. You need to use Barb Barrage 20 times as a strong move in order to evolve Quillfish. And of course you need to infer that from Quillfish's Pokedex requirements. So the fact is, these are incredibly difficult Pokemon to get, and it's the only way you can get them. Sorry for those of you who skipped BDSP, but if you're trying to complete your Pokedex without a guide, you're going to be skipping these Pokemon too. Closing up the first half of this list is going to be the forces of nature. Thunderous, Landorus, Tornadus, and finally the all-new Enamorus. These 4 are difficult to get if you don't have the correct tools to handle them. Once you're into the post-game, you'll be tasked with capturing the original 3 forces, and to do so, you need to find them in 3 different areas. You're able to locate Landorus on Ramanas Island in the Obsidian Fieldlands after doing some searching, which is easy enough. Though after that, you've got to head to Alabaster Icelands to find Tornadus, and it's only available during a snowstorm, while Thunderous is floating on water in the Cobalt Coastlands during a thunderstorm. That means you'll need to constantly reset the area through sleeping, or heading back to Jubilife in order to get these Pokemon to spawn. Then, when they do, you have to break their shields 3 times before they're stunned, and you can actually battle or catch them. It's easier said than done, since they run very far away when you get too close, and you'll effectively need jet balls to really have a shot at breaking these shields. They'll constantly attack you with tornadoes, and usually they're around an alpha Pokemon that will for sure annoy the hell out of you. As for Enamorus, you then need to get full Pokedex entries for the other 3 genies, and it's just awful. You have to do the same thing practically for 3 straight Pokemon, all to have to go and then catch Enamorus the same way you had to do the other 3. It's not fun. It's just a chore to go about getting these Mons and actually completing the quest. They're hard, and not in a fun way. To think it gets worse from here when it gets difficult in these games. It really turns things up a notch. So opening up our top 5 is an entry I consider to be about as difficult as the forces of nature, but ultimately quite a bit harder due to the quantity. All 28 unknown are sharing this spot, as you have to search every nook and cranny of the region just to get them. There are little hints in the Pokedex to tell you where every unknown is, but that only helps a little bit. You need to solve every riddle, get to the proper areas that they're alluding to, and then on top of that, find the proper way to catch them. For example, there is an unknown that is attached to the volcano in the Cobalt Coastlands, and you have to use some sort of feather ball to get it, as throwing normal Pokeballs won't work due to how high up the volcano is. It can be straight up miserable at times, pinpointing the exact location of where these unknown are so you can add them into the dex. At the very least, there are some funny locations, like the one on Magikarp's Eye at the top of the Galaxy headquarters, and the one behind your house in Jubilife Village. But the few laugh hunting these unknown can break are far outweighed by the aggravation of cracking the riddles and finding wherever they may be. If you guys think it's harder to deal with the forces of nature, let me know, because I'm open to the argument. Here at number 4, we have got Spiritomb, which is sort of like a distant cousin of Unknown in these games. What I mean by that is they both operate in a similar way. You need to find all 28 Unknown in the world by way of cracking riddles. While with Spiritomb, you just need to find 107 wisps scattered all about. Yeah, that's it, just 107 wisps. So, super easy, right? Well, okay, maybe it's not easy at all. If you don't have a guide, it's going to take you hours to find all the wisps out there in the world, especially considering there are no hints. You just know that there are 20 in each area, with 7 in Jubilife Village. And that's it. It's a fun idea that you need to get all 107 spirits to make up this thing, but God, It's just so much work to put in for a single Pokemon to show up that isn't even a legendary or something game-breaking. It's funny considering Spiritomb made an appearance on the BDSP list I did about this topic. But it just seems like Spiritomb will probably never truly be an easy Pokemon to capture. But I guess that at least means Game Freak is staying true to its gimmick no matter what. Giratina is taking the third spot on this list. And while it might surprise some of you to have it here, have you even played the post-game? It might be majorly time-consuming to get Spiritomb and Unknown, especially if you're not using a guide, but Giratina is just straight up difficult because of the way you unlock it. You have to beat Volo in the post-game, and then defeat Giratina twice in a row afterward, and then head to Turnback Cave, where you must tussle with it once more and capture it. That's really the issue here, having to win that slew of difficult battles. You've basically got to beat Cynthia's team, and then, with no automatic healing between battles, take out Giratina in both of its forms. This is majorly difficult for a game that by no means prioritized battling prior to this point in quite such a way. If you're not someone who is putting the grit items to use either, well, your Pokemon will tremble at the might of this challenge. It's kinda just that. Truly a difficult challenge. I don't have much else to say on Giratina, so let's move on. In our penultimate spot today, this list is officially being invaded by the memes. You know what the single most complicated Pokemon in this game is? Why, it's Cherim. It and Cherubi are only available in 3 specific trees in the game, and that is it. You can find Cherubi in an outbreak, sure, as I did, but we all know that the odds of outbreaks giving you the exact Pokemon you want or need are incredibly low. So much so that it isn't particularly worth counting. It can truly feel impossible at times to try to get Cherubi to leap from a tree. You have to fly or run over to a specific area, check to see if things are shaking, and then if they're not, you head back to Jubilife Village. And it's just over and over and over with no result, unless you're incredibly lucky. The argument can be made that this damn thing is one of the most miserable Pokemon anyone has ever tried to get their hands on. I feel like continuing the talk about it here would just make me angry and not make for entertaining content. So I'm cutting this entry here. The memes win today, but even they can't touch God. My judgment has been placed, and the hardest Pokemon to get in Legends Arceus, it's Arceus itself. Can you guys blame me for putting it here? Come on. You can call it a cop-out, but I call it the only correct answer. You need to capture every single Pokemon in the Hisui region and handle every single mission put in front of you in order to get Arceus to appear before you. You'll end up taking it on in a similar challenge when you handle the Noble Pokemon, and it is by no means an easy go-around. It's a challenge not just to get Arceus to meet with you, but also to beat it. It's definitely a worthwhile reward for all the hard work you put in, but that does not change the fact that there has never been a more difficult set of conditions that must be met before you can capture a certain Pokemon. Arceus today takes the cake as the hardest Pokemon to obtain in its very own game, and I can't see any Pokemon dethroning it in a future release anytime soon.
Best Team for Scarlet and Violet will be out this Sunday, December 11th at 10 a.m. Eastern / 7 a.m. Pacific, so make sure you all save the date. You're not going to want to miss it. I've mentioned it before, and I'll say it again. Catching Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet is a lot of fun. And I don't think that's exactly a hot take. Despite the large lack of polish the games have on a technical level, it still manages to capture a certain magic that some fans have been wanting to feel more of in the core games for a long time now, me being one of those fans. That being said, if you want to catch every Pokemon available in the game, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Even in a scenario with perfect programming, it's clear that some Pokemon are more difficult to catch than others, usually intentionally so, but not always. So what exactly are the hardest Pokemon to catch in Scarlet and Violet? Let's find out. Before we start though, you guys should head over to Mystic Umbreon Shorts, where we'll be having daily Scarlet and Violet content coming out, as well as daily Pokemon facts.
after the best team goes up, I will actually be starting a brand new Scarlet and Violet series exclusively over there on Mystic Umbreon Shorts that I think the majority of you guys will like. Also, if you like anime and fanfics, head over to Mystic Reads, where I'm currently reading Road to be a Pokemon Master Kanto Edition, an adventure with Ash and Serena going through Kanto together. If you like anime, I'm reading through the Yaju Sanin, a Naruto fanfic. I will leave the links for both these channels in the description below and the iCard above. Starting off this list without wasting any time is Glimmet. If you finished this game and have tried completing your Pokedex, then you probably knew Glimmet would appear somewhere on this list. Or maybe you just got lucky and immediately got one when you saw it attached to the wall. But either way, this Pokemon is only available in specific cave areas in the region. Not only that, but even if you know what specific areas and walls it can appear on, it's all too often that you won't find one at all. If you don't even know this Pokemon exists, you can miss it entirely. Now, even if you've gotten lucky enough and have been able to see several Glimmet, the fact that it doesn't appear often in these specific areas means that something like shiny or nature hunting for the one you might want, if you're more hardcore, can be a serious pain. Also, while the catch rate for this isn't the worst, it's low enough to add another notch to the fact that it's just not an easy Pokemon to just randomly come around. That being said, this all still could be a lot worse, which is why this Pokemon is only at our number 10 spot. At number 9 is a Pokemon that has become, perhaps, a tiny bit infamous, Flamigo. Though it's more due to the fact that it kinda just looks like regular Flamingo to some people and not much else. This entry is here more due to how difficult it can be to catch in relation to how early you can encounter it. Compared to other Pokemon you can come across early on, Flamigo has given players much more problems than you would expect from something that would be seen as kinda basic. Depending on where you live in real life, your luck in-game could be so bad early on with regular Pokeballs that you may have a better chance at going outside and trying to capture an actual Flamingo. This does make sense, however, as it's much stronger than most other Pokemon you can find early on too, even if its type combo leaves it open to maybe a few too many weaknesses for some players' liking. Here at number 8, we have more of a general placement rather than a specific Pokemon. I'll keep this brief, but essentially, the placement belongs to pseudos in general. They are available earlier than some may expect, but that's not totally new. Recent generations have had some pseudos available early on that may not have been expected either, so there's not too much new to say. That being said, these pseudos will typically be harder to catch than something like Flamigo, especially with how lesser equipped you are during those earlier points in your adventure. You'll be tempted to give it a shot with weaker Pokeball choices, and before you know it, you've spent over 10 balls on a single Pokemon. Next, we have something that may be a bit more familiar already for those of you that have played Sword and Shield, Indeedee. This Pokemon already has a very low catch rate, but the real reason it makes it into this list is the fact that it's only findable in one area, all the way out in a distant corner of the North Province. There were probably a few players that found this Pokemon naturally, but maybe didn't have enough Pokeballs to reliably catch it. Especially if they didn't have a Pokemon that could put up a reliable status element, like Sleep for example. But usually if you're catching Pokemon, you probably do have reliable setups. It's just the fact that it's so insanely out of reach and easy to miss if you don't intend on exploring every corner of the map looking for every single Pokemon. At number 6, we've got Bombirdier. This I would only consider a tiny bit more difficult than Indeedee, our previous entry. Bombirdier is much easier to find early in the game, but that catch rate is pretty low. You can mostly find this Pokemon on the western part of the map, but if you come across it early, you're going to have some serious problems actually catching it. Whereas with Indeedee, by the time you cross it, you'll likely be pretty well equipped to deal with the goal of catching one. Not to mention, depending just exactly how early you come across a Bombardier, you kinda sorta might get destroyed. This thing's speed is pretty decent, and its physical attack stat is over 100. Every time it breaks from your Pokeball, and it's not under something like the sleep status effect, it's going to hurt your team, especially if it's filled with a bunch of much weaker unevolved Pokemon. This entry is yet another one that I wouldn't consider all that far from the previous one in terms of difficulty. Orthworm is found in the desert areas of the region, and like Bombardier, it isn't too hard to find in the wild once you understand this fact. Unfortunately, it also has the same extremely low catch rate, and what puts Orthworm above the others so far is that you can't just run up to it to encounter it. Orthworm will actively avoid you if it senses your presence in any way. You'll need to actually sneak behind it carefully to catch it. If you're not used to moving around like this to capture certain Pokemon off guard before encountering one of these, then you're going to have a lot more trouble trying to encounter your first Orthworm than most other players. Here's a Pokemon that you pretty much only encounter later on in the game rather than earlier, Dondozo. Once again, this Pokemon has the same very low catch rate as Bombardier and Orthworm, but not only is it going to be at consistently fairly high levels, this thing hits pretty freaking hard. On top of that, you'll actually need to know how to get your mascot Pokemon to learn how to swim in order to actually reach it. Dondozo has low speed, but insane bulk and physical defense, and pretty high attack too. Every time your Pokeball doesn't work, there's a chance you're gonna get hit hard. That's one of the reasons it's this high on this list. With Orthworm, it's mostly just your typical Steel-type tank you would expect. High defense, but not quite as offensively based. Dodonzo's defense isn't much lower, and it has way more health, like almost double. But at least with high health, you're less likely to cause this Pokemon to faint by accident. A low catch rate can be dealt with as long as you're prepared. But if a strong Pokemon can't be controlled too well by the player, it'll start chipping away at your team as you're wasting turns just throwing balls at it. These situations where turns are spent just attempting to catch a Pokemon means that its low speed won't matter, it's just going to try to feast on your team while you try to catch it each turn. Thankfully, stuff like net balls and even timer balls can help you with this one if you're struggling. Number 3 is Basculin. Yeah, I know you're wondering how that could possibly be ahead of number 4. This is once again somewhat in relation to when you would actually encounter one of these. If you're watching this and haven't had too much time to play Scarlet and Violet, and maybe have only had time to get like one badge, there's a good chance you've at least seen Basculin swimming across a river or something. If you see one of these before you know how to swim, it's kind of a pain to enter and encounter with, but it is very much possible. And if you're facing one of these this early, then it's probably the hardest catch rate you've faced up to that point, being once again the same as the previous entry. Basculin is not seen as a terribly impressive Pokemon, but it will be stronger than your Pokemon near the start of the game. You also won't have access to net balls or even ultra balls at this point of the game either, outside of maybe just one or two you may happen to come across in the open world nearby. There's also just the idea of attempting to catch this thing in the first place. Unless you're the type of player that has to catch every new Pokemon they see, and hey, I don't blame you, I did that myself. Or you're specifically trying to complete the dex, most people may just end up ignoring this Pokemon for better or for worse. In our penultimate spot, we have a shared entry between Roaring Moon and Iron Valiant. Paradox Pokemon would have actually been its own placement, like Pseudo's much earlier in the list, but these two stand out among the rest as the most difficult to catch in this category. I don't want to say too much, as I'll come off as redundant, but trying to catch these two is very similar to catching a legendary. An intensely low catch rate, with these two specifically being in a hidden spot in Area 0 while being a pretty tough encounter overall. They're both fast and hit pretty dang hard, so you'd better be prepared to put them in a situation where you're able to use Pokeballs over and over comfortably, or you'll end up getting swept. With our previous entries out of the way, I think it's safe to say that our number 1 spot is pretty obvious. The 4 treasures of Ruined Pokemon. All 4 of them have a lower catch rate than anything on this list, albeit still not quite the lowest in the series. But the catch rate can always be overcome. It's the process of even getting to these guys that makes putting them at the number 1 spot feel like a no-brainer. In order to access these areas where these Pokemon are hidden, you need to find 8 stakes that each Pokemon is associated with. That's 32 stakes in total if you want to catch all 4. While it's not too terrible after your first or second one you've caught, the process starts to feel extra tedious for most players. Of course, they're legendaries, and for the most part, these Pokemon have effective stat distribution, either being really fast with high damaging power, or having high damage with very chunky bulk. So, like with the previous entry, you'd better be prepared to deal with these Pokemon when the time comes to encounter them.